Good evening, creatures of the night. Don't forget to check out my new book, now available on Amazon.com, on Kindle, paperback, and hardcover. The link is on the description of this episode below. Enjoy the show. On Saturday, July 5th, 2008, at approximately 4:41 a.m., I witnessed a strange creature as I drove south on North Holly Road towards Holly, Michigan. This event lasted 9 to 10 seconds. This incident occurred when I was under a mile away from Grange Hall Road. I was coming back from dropping off a volunteer that I worked with at an art center in Davison. I didn't drink anything and wasn't on any medication or illegal drugs. I was drinking a soda, but I didn't even feel tired, even though it was late. My speed was slower than the posted limit, about 45 miles per hour, and I had my brights on. I do this so I can be prepared when a deer decides to cross my path. No other vehicles were present during this encounter. As I was driving, I slowed down because there appeared to be a very large creature digging in someone's trash next to the road on the right-hand side. It was located 20 to 25 feet away from my car. I began to slow down to get a better look. This thing was really tall, and too huge to be any average animal that I normally see in roadside trash bins at night. My first thought that came to mind was, what is it? I remember calling out words of animals in my head to determine what this thing could be. I thought, a rat? No. Too big. Kangaroo? It is gray. Red eyes? Maybe a rabbit. No, not a cat either. It jumps and leaps, kind of like a rabbit. But I still don't know what I'm looking at. Can it be a chupacabra? Could it? In Michigan? This creature was holding a piece of trash. It didn't appear to have paws, more like slender hands. It had huge, round, and glowing red eyes. It reacted and looked kind of surprised to see me, as if it thought no one will ever see me and find out that I exist. That was the impression that I got looking at this thing. Its eyes just stared at my vehicle while holding onto a piece of trash for nearly 4 seconds. Its triangular-like face reminded me of a dog, but it was pointier and more triangular towards the end of the nose and mouth. Its presence didn't seem to be ordinary, and those gigantic, glowing red eyes made me feel like it was definitely something out of place. Its ears were large and rounded, sort of like a mouse. Its arms were bendable and closer to its body than its long, flexible legs. The body was heavier at the bottom and kind of resembled a kangaroo if you ask me. But he was completely gray. Maybe gray short fur? Maybe it was just its skin. I'm not sure. But the body was definitely gray in color. It had a skinny tail that was similar in appearance to a rat's tail, but it was much longer and slightly wider. I barely noticed this creature's tail until it maneuvered out of the way from the garbage can. In summary, this is the way the creature reacted when I came upon it. I noticed the creature digging in the garbage, and it was holding a piece of trash. It stared at me for 3 to 4 seconds, then dropped the trash forcefully like a human would with both hands. It was standing upright and appeared to be over 3 feet tall in height. The creature bent down to the ground and jumped forward on all 4 legs, then got up a bit and turned to the left to aim for the woods. It reached for the ground again with its front arms and jumped forward with its back legs swinging in front of it like a rabbit would. This creature, whatever it was, didn't make any sounds that I could hear, even with my windows open, and it didn't try to attack me or hiss at me. When the event was over, I wanted to turn around and find out what that thing was. But I knew that wouldn't be a good idea, so I didn't. My gut tells me that this thing had to be a chupacabra. I looked up a chupacabra on the internet the next day, discovered a photo that was taken by a rancher in 2004 of a creature that he shot and killed. The creature in that photo looked very similar to the one that I witnessed, except obviously it was dead, and the dead animal had less flesh on its bones. I couldn't see the slender hands, but it was hard to tell from the photo. I was planning on getting some land so I could let my pet cat out at night, but now I think there's going to be a change of plans. So what do you think this was? Do you think there really was a chupacabra all the way out where I live? Because I thought that they were only in Puerto Rico, Mexico, and Texas. I've never heard of one in Michigan. Do you think it could have been a baby Dogman? Or was it some other cryptid that we haven't discovered yet? I'm curious either way, and look forward to seeing the comments in your video below. Have a good night. My mom's home is situated in the middle of the Appalachian Mountains. She has one neighbor near her mother-in-law, my stepfather's mom. There are no other houses anywhere around them, just beautiful mountains. One night, her dog was barking, crying, and growling, and just wouldn't stop. My mom was a tad confused as there wasn't any outside noises that she herself could hear, and the dog was just pacing to the door and the windows. After about an hour, she decided to grab her flashlight and go outside to make sure everything was okay, and that there wasn't any animals messing with her in the trash bin. She figured her dog was just picking up the smell of a raccoon or some other nocturnal animal. She scanned her yard and the creek and didn't see anything out of place. No animals at all, and her trash hadn't been tipped over. But as she turned to go back inside, that's when she saw this thing. I'll give the description the best that I can, based off of her description towards me, as I've never actually seen this thing myself, and I hope that I never do. It was standing on its back legs. The back legs looked animal-like, and the front looked more human. It wasn't hairless, but looked as if it might have had mange, with long fur here and there. The top half looked like a humanoid man, while the lower half looked like an animal. She stood paralyzed with fear, shining her light on it. It looked at her, and then started walking, on all fours, out of her yard and into the mountains. As it did, this creature stopped and looked back at her, then finally disappeared into the darkness. She had a second encounter that wasn't as intense as that one, but still worth mentioning either way. It was weeks later when her dog began acting out again. She tries her best now not to go outside once the sun goes down. She turned her lights off inside and looked out of her kitchen window. With the light from her yard, she was able to see into her backyard again. And although this thing was further away this time, and not as detailed, she said she was positive it was the same creature that she saw a couple of weeks before. She said it had the same shape. She instantly knew that it was just the same thing that was over by her yard earlier, and it ran chills down her spine. She said she closed her eyes and let go of her blinds so that they would close, and stood there with her eyes closed for what felt like several minutes. When she opened her eyes and pulled down the blinds again to look back outside, this thing was gone. She said it took everything in her to open those blinds back up and look out. For weeks following, she would shoot her gun off right at the edge of dark. Now, anytime her dog acts out, she'll scan her yard, and then step out onto the porch, with the back door still open just in case, and shoot her gun a couple of times, just to hopefully scare whatever this thing is off of her property. She hasn't encountered it again, but she's afraid that one day she will. This took place in eastern Kentucky, and it only happened in the summer of 2019. Wendigos are real. I know, because I've run into them many times. They are massive, fully grown, 4 meters, give or take, and they look like gray aliens with protruding fangs and huge feline eyes that typically shine red in the light. I live in Canada, on the outskirts of Ottawa, close to the Ottawa River, where the majority of my encounters have occurred. I don't carry a gun either, but I don't think it would do much good anyway against these creatures. I do carry a Bowie knife and or a machete, just in case. I may have to make a last stand, but lucky so far, I've been spared that horror. Like humans, I think there's good and bad individuals, and not all my encounters were terrifying. I saw one swim by me from about 30 to 40 feet away, using a tree as a flotation device, just to hide behind. I got a perfect look at its head and upper body. Not long after that, I was riding a bike down a country road near my house in a thickly forested area, and I think the same one I saw on the river was keeping pace with me. I caught a glimpse of a white blur and a huge head with squinted huge eyes, and I sped up as fast as the adrenaline and bike would let me until I reached a streetlight and skidded to a halt. I looked back, but it must have found it back into the trees because I didn't see anything after that. I went straight back home after that. At that time I was in my mid-teens, and something about that one made me believe that it was an adolescent female, but I can't be sure. About a year or two later, me and a friend went to some bleachers that backed to an old growth forest about 200 to 300 meters away, just after it got dark outside. The lights from a baseball diamond nearby were illuminating the top of the forest canopy, and I glanced up and saw two massive red feline eyes open. They looked at me, and then they closed again. I was shocked and in awe before my nerves got the best of me, and I suggested to my oblivious friend that we should get out of there without elaborating on what I'd seen. Since then, I've come into contact with them a few more times, and they do mimic voices, and may actually grasp what they mean. I'd taken out an 8-inch Bowie knife after seeing what looked like a lantern swinging down from the riverside from the top of a path of trees in a remote area next to the mouth of a local stream. Something said, "Nice knife," to me, as I stretched and practiced defensive moves with it. I'd been drinking, but I knew what it was. I went down to the opposite side of the stream mouth with my knife in front of me. I looked back into the water, and just below the surface, I saw a huge white face with beet red, angry eyes staring up at me. Lucky for me, it receded away back into the depths, but by then, I had run out of the liquid courage that allowed me to have risked my life to that point. A few weeks later, I went to the spot on the other side of the stream where I saw it descend with the lantern, and I saw trees that had been roughly snapped 10 feet apart, leading up to a tall one that had a Y split at the top. I guess this might be a hunting roost for it, so far as I can tell. I went back recently in the spring, when the banks were flooded on a moonlit night, and sure enough, I heard what was clearly a huge biped sloshing around on the banks. I'd seen a pair of agitated beavers earlier. They were there before the sun went down, so I wonder if maybe they were on the menu that evening. Not far from where I live now, in the east end of Ottawa, Ontario, there is a karst cave system that runs for miles. There's a stream that runs through the area bordered by farms and houses with lots of forest ravines along it. There's an area along it that has a beautiful waterfall, but the landowner has a no trespassing sign all over the place, so it's always risky to try and make your way through it, especially in his section of the area. That didn't deter me from exploring it though, although later I'd realize why he was trying to keep people out. After having so many encounters with cryptids and the paranormal, I finally decided to try and officially investigate it, and bought a decent digital camera and a high-powered flashlight. I snuck into the area one night next to the waterfall to record some video. I didn't capture anything, but as I stood there taking in the beauty of the area, I heard a deep, soft voice say to me, "They think I'm ugly." And I replied, "Then they're too ignorant to understand." After this, I didn't hear anything anymore, and eventually made my way back home. I eventually went back weeks later to explore more of the area, starting further down the stream from the waterfall, and came across a large bare footprints leading up from the stream into the mud. I gradually made my way deeper into the wooded ravines, and not far away, as I crested the ridge, I came to a small clearing at the far end of a home in the woods that I'd never seen before. Just as I crested this rise, I saw a 7 to 8 foot tall, well-built, pale white humanoid with black tiger-like stripes along its body run back down into the ravine. Its head and face were obscured by the trees, so I couldn't look at its features. I gave it a few minutes to get a comfortable distance away, and then I followed it into the ravine. I got most of the way down, and I heard it climbing up between two trees about 50 to 100 meters off to my left in the woods. I sat down on the fallen log and took out a 40-ounce bottle of Old English malt liquor that I brought along with me. It had an apprehensive response when I opened my bag to retrieve my bottle, so I tried to move slowly and act unthreateningly. I talked to it for a bit, but got no response, so after roughly half an hour, I shouldered my bag and crossed the other side of the ravine, but I made my way to the right. A canine started barking furiously somewhere close behind me, and then it abruptly stopped. I can only guess what kind of a canine it was. A dog? A wolf? A coyote? And I can only surmise why it suddenly stopped. Eventually, I hiked back out of the wooded area and across the farmer's fields and went home. About a week or two later, in mid-June, I went back, but took a more direct route through the farmer's fields to the area where I saw it. As I got into the ravines, I came across a rough track that made a path through the woods. I was headed to a spot in the ravines where a large tree had fallen across a small stream. The path led me to the wooded area into a grassy meadow that was to my left. There was a small tree to my left just before I came into the meadow, about 15 feet away. As I was passing the tree, I saw the back of a hulking 8 to 10 foot tall, pure white humanoid in the middle of that meadow, about 40 to 50 feet away. He was so massive, the back of him was hairless. His head looked too small for his body. He became aware of me and cocked his head to the side. He covered his face with his hands as he turned around and loped towards the back of the small tree that was just in front of me to my left. As I stepped back in shock, I managed to exclaim in a quavering voice, "You're incredible." I could see the bottom half of his massive legs and feet. His toes were so well built they seemed like blocks rather than rounded like ours. In an instant, he shot back away down the path that I had just come from and back into the trees. He moved so fast, all I could see was a blur. I was in a state of shock again, but I forced myself through the thicket on the side of the ravine and across the ankle-deep water to the other side. I was about 50 meters away from the fallen tree that I was initially going to, when I heard something heavy crashing through the trees on the other side. In a panic, I grabbed the thing closest to me to defend myself. It turned out to just be a stick. I sighed with relief when I realized that the thing crashing around was just a clumsy turkey. I made my way onto the fallen tree and started drinking a bottle of Old English again. I'd calmed down some when I heard something say to me, "Just go home." And I replied, "I will soon." After I finished my bottle, I trekked out and back home. To be honest, I've seen more than just Wendigo on my treks through the woods here. It's incredible what's out here and deliberately being kept from the general public's knowledge. Sasquatch are out here too. I've seen more than one. I think the first one was a female, but I can't be too sure. It was about 7 to 8 feet tall and had a lean, but not bulky build. It whipped a pebble at my shoulder, spat on me, brushed my shoulder lightly as I passed by it on a narrow trail in the dark, and pushed me onto one of my knees as I was leaving the paths of the area. I had multiple encounters with that one that night. The first time I saw it was during the evening, just before the sun went down, and I got a good look. It looked like a chimpanzee type, with patches of hair and spots of its body that made me guess it was transitioning into a winter coat or something. This occurred in the early fall. I've also seen a big, long-haired reddish-brown one. I'm pretty sure that's a male. And this one was more recently. It grunted at me as I walked by him from behind a tree. I'd seen him make his way to it before I crossed in front of him. He moved around the area as I sat nearby, and I tried to talk to him, but he left the area about 15 to 20 minutes later. Honestly, I haven't been back in the woods since then. I think I caused them enough grief, and I'm just lucky that it was them I encountered, and not something more violent or aggressive. I never did see the Wendigo's faces, but I'd imagine they aren't all that different from our own, since they look so similar in build to humans. I know a lot of this is hard to swallow, but I assure you that it's true. I have nothing to gain from lying. I'm just a guy that likes to go out into the wilderness and find things that shouldn't be there. Thanks for listening. Have a good night.
Hi,
I had an experience that I wondered if any of your listeners could relate to. I know I am of sound mind and saw what I saw. I just don't know what it is for sure what I saw. It was Thursday, September 8th, 2016, and I was on a trip from Erie, Pennsylvania to visit my friend in North Carolina. I had rented a car as I didn't think my 20-year-old truck would make it, and I had my GPS take me on a route to bypass toll roads on the way down. I was driving for about 5.5 hours when I left Route 64 and drove on Airport Road, then came to a little town called Beaver in West Virginia. I made a pit stop at KFC, and that's when I found out where I was. After I left, I made a right out of their parking lot onto Ritter Drive on Route 19. As I was leaving, I was going slowly, as I hadn't picked up speed from pulling out of the parking lot yet, or I'm sure I never would have noticed it. I was coming up on some leaves spread across the road when I noticed the leaves were moving, but there was no wind blowing. I slowed down, thinking there may be a critter in the leaves, and I didn't want to hit it. I was looking really hard because I could see the leaves moving, but I didn't see an animal. Then I could make out a small bipedal figure about 7 to 8 inches tall that seemed to be trying to hide itself in the leaves as it tried to get across the road. It looked as if I could see a line of each part of the creature, but it seemed to be cloaked, kind of like what a chameleon does, but not quite the same thing. All I could make out is a stick figure walking through the leaves. I could see the beginning of the limbs, but the rest seemed to dissipate. If you watch the video that I give you a link to, you'll see what I mean. It's hard to explain. I think I was by Cardinal Lane on Ritter Drive. This thing moved with a ratchet-type movement, rather jerky. I don't know if it was its normal gait, or if it was injured. At this point, I was driving at a crawl, because I was seeing something so bizarre, and I was still trying to make out what it was. I was thinking to myself, what in the hell is this thing? I thought maybe it was an emaciated squirrel, but they don't walk on 2 feet, and if it was that skinny, I'm sure it would be dead, not jerking across the road. And it was not a featherless bird either. It had made it to the center line, and was attempting to cross the rest of the road, when a pickup truck from the other side came speeding along, and just missed it with its driver's side tires. I saw leaves and it being thrown, so I don't know if it made it or not. As the cars behind me were starting to honk, I was forced to move on. I thought about turning around to see if I could find it, because that's what I would do for a regular animal. But this thing was not a regular animal. So I wasn't going to take a chance of it being dangerous, or even more so if it was injured. For the next 60 miles, I had to really concentrate on my driving, as I was still nervous about what I had seen, and I don't scare easily. The more I thought about it, I thought it may have been cloaked, as it was picking up the color of the leaves to disguise itself. It reminded me of the way the movie Predator depicted the aliens cloaking themselves. I could see it, but I couldn't make out what it was. Like I said earlier, I have a link for you that you can add to the bottom of your video. It's really close to what I had seen. As I have tried to rationalize this in my head, I thought maybe it was a reptile or a lizard of some kind, maybe a chameleon that can turn different colors to hide itself. An octopus can do the same thing. Maybe we've just never seen this type of animal before. When I got to my friend's house that night, I told her about what I saw. She never doubted me, as I'm not prone to making up stories, and I'm a very rational person. Her son mentioned something about Bigfoot being sighted down there, and I asked if he'd ever heard anything about Dogman. He said no, so I started to tell them what I had heard about them, when my friend interrupted me and asked me if I remembered when she saw what she thought was a Dogman a few years back. What I mean is there was a large dog-like thing in her backyard. When she brought that up, I remembered the incident, as I told her that she should have called the Game Commission and reported. She said this thing was standing around in her backyard, just looking around, and this was a few years after she had moved to North Carolina. It was very large, and she said it was standing on all fours. The head was higher than the 4-foot chain-link fence around one of her tenants' houses, where he had the dog fenced in. The dog was hiding in the doghouse, and she was afraid for her cats. So she took a broom and walked out the door to shoo it off. It then started towards her. She jumped back in the door and shut it, and then called me. I told her to call the game commission, as a wolf won't generally do that. It would prefer to avoid people. Unless, of course, it has rabies. Plus, the only wolves around there would be the red wolves, and they aren't much bigger than a coyote. They gave her the runaround and told her it was just a dog, and to call the Humane Society. Apart from being very large, she also said it had long, shaggy gray fur, and it had a funny-looking face. She said it didn't really look like a dog, and when they looked online, none of the pictures of wolves or coyotes looked like it either. She said it had yellow eyes, and that it had a mean-looking face that was showing more expression than a dog or other animal does. More human-like. And that's what freaked her out most. I didn't know anything about Dogman at the time she called me, which was probably best, as I would have worried about her a lot. She said she hasn't seen anything like it since, and thank God, but who knows if it's still hanging around. You don't always see them. There's lots of bizarre things going on south of the Mason-Dixon line, and I'm glad I only visit there every couple of years. I won't tell you my name, or where I live exactly, but I will tell you that I reside in the Cayman Islands, which is located in the Caribbean, right below Cuba on the world map. I'm an accountant, and my wife of 9 years, who has traveled with me, is a successful lawyer. Coming from the Caribbean, we have no carnivores or forests on our island, so I have no knowledge of large animals in the wild, nor do I ever intend to seek them out. Every year, my wife and I travel to a state in the U.S. and drive through another before catching a flight back home. It's usually a 7-day trip. That year, we decided to travel to Chicago because I grew up a huge Bulls fan. After spending 2 days in Chicago, we decided to drive through Iowa, then end up in Kansas City before catching a flight to Miami and back home. We left Chicago on Route 88, then connected to 80 and drove to Des Moines. When we got to Des Moines, it was late in the afternoon, but we kept on driving. We took Route 35 heading towards St. Charles, and by this time it was late afternoon and the sun was setting. My wife was sleeping in the passenger seat, and I was going about 40 miles per hour at the time. We came to a dense area of trees, and about 50 yards ahead of me, something stepped onto the side of the road. What I saw was a large dog-like creature standing on 2 legs with its nose in the air, as if it was sniffing something. I drove past this creature, still going about 40 miles per hour, and I could tell by its genitals it was male. It looked like when you hold up a male dog on its 2 front legs. Its genitals were the height of my driver's side window, so it had to be at least 7 to 8 feet tall. After getting about 50 yards past this animal, I stopped the car in disbelief and just stared at this massive creature through my inside mirror. It looked at the car and made a blood-curdling howl that woke my wife. It then started to walk at pace towards the car and dropped to all 4s. I was in disbelief, but the fear and panic I felt for my wife and myself made me react, so I hit the gas again and quickly got to about 30 miles per hour. The animal made another howl, and to my disbelief, 2 smaller creatures leapt to the road and pursued my car. At this time, my wife was screaming bloody murder. The biggest of the dogmen was a brownish color, like the movie Van Helsing. However, the 2 that jumped out after it were more of a dirty gray color, and almost seemed juvenile, based on the interactions with the brown one when they finally caught up to it. It was more like the way a puppy plays with an adult dog, but still respects the adult dog. At least, that was what I got from it. It definitely felt like the brown one was the alpha. The largest one managed to get to the car before I could accelerate fast enough. It got back on 2 legs and grabbed at the trunk of the rental car. When he grabbed the car, I felt the immediate decrease in speed. I swerved to throw him off, and thankfully it worked. I swerved the car to the next lane, and it let go and fell back to all 4s, stumbling. I feel like if I didn't swerve the car, it would have easily picked up the vehicle from the back, bringing it to a stop, as this was a front-wheel driven car. At this time, I'm not ashamed to say that I soiled my pants out of sheer panic and horror. After getting to about 50 miles per hour, they seemed to give up, and the largest one just stood in the middle of the road while the other 2 caught up to him. I was still looking in the inside mirror at 3 creatures that were not supposed to exist. Then all 3 dropped to all fours and leapt out of the road. What I saw were 3 animals with wolf-like faces. One a brownish golden color, the other 2 grayish. All 3 had long, muscular front arms with long, curved claws. They had pointed ears and huge canine teeth. The big one's eyes looked empty and without any remorse, and I honestly believe they had every intent to attack us if they had caught us. When I finally decided to stop my car, we were in Kentucky. I looked at the trunk, and there were claw marks on each side of the back panel, as if the creature was hugging the back of the car, like it wanted to forcefully stop it. Needless to say, I had to pay for the damage and the cleaning to the inside because of the smell of urine. I will never drive through the United States again, and even on my island, I still struggle to look through my inside mirror for fear of what I will see there. My wife had to seek counseling because every crack she heard, she would panic, and she would not go outside alone at night. We live on a small island, and our lives have changed forever. If you ever watched Van Helsing, the brown werewolf is the closest I have seen to what we saw. My wife almost went into shock when she saw the creature on screen. I truly believe it smelt my wife's monthly, and that is what prompted it to attack us. These animals are intelligent, and I felt as though this was not the first time they have attacked a vehicle, because I didn't see any fear from them. Most animals would react in fear if they encountered a vehicle coming at them. This was more like, hey, there's something in this vehicle that we can snack on. They didn't appear to be curious. I really felt like they have done this before. I'm sharing this story in hopes that somebody else had the same experience as I did. I was traveling Highway 10 from the west coast to the south coast of Florida. I was with my 6 kids and pulling a trailer with all of my belongings and 3 dogs in it. I was in a big SUV, and it was around 2 a.m. The kids were all asleep, and my 13-year-old daughter was in the passenger seat to make sure I stayed awake. After traveling Highway 10 for 3 days, I had decided since we reached Florida, we would cut through the state to save some time. So we got off of Highway 10 on an off-road in hopes of getting gas and making up some time. It was along Route 27. We came to the first little gas station, and it was closed. I was nervous because I knew we needed gas, but we continued on. I told my daughter to keep an eye out for deer crossing the 2-lane deserted highway, because hitting a deer would kill us all and turn us over due to the trailer we were pulling. I was driving slowly, and I was very cautious about where we were going. We were traveling around 45 miles per hour. I remember this so clearly, just like it was yesterday, but it was a very long time ago. We had our brights on because the road was dark and winding. A few houses were on that highway, but not many. As we came around a corner, in the headlights on the road, there was a lot of blood. Fresh blood. And on the side of the road was this 5 or 6 foot tall creature. It was on its hind legs, hunched over this dead deer, and eating it. It didn't look up. Not even when my headlights hit it. It was using its arms like a human, eating the deer. It had a very muscular body, pointed ears, and a long muzzle. If you ever saw a werewolf, this was it. It had a skinnier lower body, but used its arms and hands just like a human would. If it looked up, I would have died. I looked over at my daughter. We were both seeing the same thing, at the same time. Tears came to my eyes instantly, and at the same time we both said, "Werewolf." I sped up because I was scared it would run and jump on the trailer and kill my dogs. As we got about a mile away, my heart was beating so hard. My daughter and I were so freaked out. This was definitely a werewolf that I'd seen. I was never a big believer in werewolves. I don't watch werewolf movies, and I have never had any reason to believe in them. But I also have no reason to make this up. And, as a matter of fact, I've only told a handful of people about this. There is a werewolf in Florida. I'm not sure the exact town or road, but I wish I did know, so I could find out if we were the only ones who have seen this thing. I lived my life wondering what that thing was, and why it was there. It was between Alabama to Florida, along the Panhandle. I will never forget this night. We had a house in West Florida back in the early to mid-80s. For over a week, our neighborhood had a series of what I believed were werewolf stalkings. It was June, I think, and around 9 p.m. I was out on the back patio. At that time, no one had fences around the property, because all of us knew the other families around the area. The only exception was the family across the street from us. They had a 7-foot-tall cinder block wall behind their house. They had a large wooded piece of property and kept equipment out there. The dad was in construction, and the wall enclosed 3 sides of the property. It was hot out, and a slight breeze. No clouds, and starry. As I sat there, you could hear the dogs in the neighborhood begin to bark. Then everything got really quiet. A lone howl started, so I howled back. I do this rather well. I'd watch National Geographic, and would mimic wolf cries. Anyways, this went on for about 5 minutes. Each time, the howl from the other end got closer. Down the road are train tracks that run north to south. The sound seemed to be coming from that direction. I started to get spooked and stopped the howling. Our yard had bushes and a tree on the side where the sound came from. The hair on my arms and neck started to stand up, so I felt like I should go inside. As I stood, I heard movement by the bushes. I glanced over and saw something move. I didn't wait to see what it was, so I booked it into the house and stood by the door, which had glass panes in it. I watched as something very large and dark moved about the bushes. It moved away, and I could no longer see it from my vantage point. I went to the porch to look out the windows, hoping to get a look at whatever was there, but it never came out that way. So I went to bed, and I read for a while to calm down. About less than a half hour later, my brother came home. He came into my room and was white as paper. He was shaking all over. His eyes were the size of saucers. I asked him if he was okay. Now, my brother is the sort that has an explanation for anything unusual. And he's a big guy, so for him to be in this state was not normal. He said, "I need you to come with me, right now. I'll explain it when we get in the truck." I was still dressed, so I got up and went with him. When we got outside, I asked what was going on. He told me there was something in the road by the tracks he needed to show me first. I was not happy about that, as I just had my own experience with something from that way. As we got there, it looked like something had exploded all over the road. There was blood everywhere, as if something was mowed down in that spot, but there were no body parts or anything like that anywhere. My brother related then what he had seen coming down the road. I was coming home, and as I got closer to the tracks, there was this huge thing lying in the road. I thought it must have been a Mastiff or a Great Dane, but as I pulled up to it, it didn't look like any kind of dog I'd ever seen. It was hairy. Its head and nose were twice that size of a normal dog. The body wasn't a dog, just dog-like, but much, much bigger. It was all over the place. There was an arm on the road. Not a dog, but a human arm. There was no trace of anything when we got there, and it had only been a couple of minutes that it took us to get there. I said to get the hell out of there, right then and there, and we went back home. I told him what I experienced just before we got home. A couple of days later, my sister came to me and said she'd been seeing a large dog prowling around at night. It was huge, and she said she saw it from across the street, as she sat on the porch. I told her about my experience in the backyard, and then what my brother and I had saw, and I asked her not to be outside alone until we could figure out what it was. We got together and decided to stake out the yard over the next night. Sure enough, it was back in the neighbor's yard. This thing was about the size of a Shetland pony, black in color. We had flashlights and turned them on to look at the back wall of the house. Their dog was going off like crazy, and they had a small terrier. We watched this dog thing scale the wall. The neighbor came back to see what was going on, and we shouted there was something in his yard. He went back in and grabbed his pistol and went back around, but by that time, it had already gone. After that, we didn't see it again. Dear Supernaturalist, my name is Lindsay Collins, and I have an encounter for you. I think you'll find it interesting. It involves an encounter with what I believe to be a banshee back when I was a child. This was 20 plus years ago now, but my belief that this was in fact a banshee has never wavered. I know what I saw. This was back when I was 12 years old. I was living with my father at the time, in a town in Ireland called Donegal. I'd never met my mother. She died when I was very young. I had a pretty lonely childhood. My dad was there, but not really. He spent a lot of time drinking, and not a lot of time with me. Even when I was a small child, I had to find ways to entertain myself. He never really played with me. It was the weekends when he was gone for his work that I got to spend with my granny that I truly cherished. She was so much fun to be around. She'd always tell me stories of what she called the little people. Back then, I never thought I would actually be telling her a story of my own. I was sleeping one night at my dad's house during a particularly nasty rainstorm when my encounter happened. The storm didn't bother me. I actually liked that kind of weather, so I was sleeping rather sound. For some reason, though, I awoke with a start and my eyes snapped open. I was suddenly wide awake. It took me a moment to adjust to the darkness and the sounds of the heavy rain, but I could also hear something else in the rain, too. I sat still and listened until I heard it again. It sounded just like a woman screaming. I got out of bed and went to the window of my room, which was on the second floor. I looked out, thinking maybe somebody was out in the storm and had lost their way, but I couldn't see anyone. Not only was the storm raging, but the direction my room faced didn't have much lighting outside, and there was a patch of woods nearby. I heard the scream again and held my breath. It didn't sound like someone was in trouble. It sounded like someone was just screaming. The scream itself was a little off, too. I mean, it sounded like a normal woman's scream, but it also had this ghostly air to it, like the scream or the voice was hollow. It's hard to explain unless you've heard it. Even as I sit here trying to type this out for you, I'm having difficulty explaining just how it sounded. I guess I just knew that something strange was going on. Either way, the scream sounded like it was coming closer. I just stood at my window and watched for whoever was coming to show themselves. I wanted to know if I needed to get my dad so we could help them or not. I was surprised when I saw this light coming from the patch of woods that my window faced, because I didn't think anyone would be out there in the storm. It was very late in the hour, and when I looked at my clock, it was after 2 a.m. I continued to watch, though, now more interested than ever. I wanted to know who was crazy enough to be walking around out in the woods with a little lantern, especially in this storm. But what I saw next turned my curiosity into fear. At first, I assumed the light was coming from a lantern or something, but as it got closer, I realized that this light was too big to be a lantern, and it was this dull, bluish-gray tone. That's when this woman walked out of the woods and started towards my house. It was her that was actually glowing. I remember everything about her, perfectly to this day. Along with this glowing aura, she had a very long gray dress that went all the way down to her ankles, and she had shoes on too. The dress was long-sleeved and looked very old indeed, although sort of tattered. She had long, whitish-gray hair, and that was down around her shoulders and covering part of her face. She was the one that was screaming, but now that it was so close, it sounded more like a moaning wail than a scream. She seemed to be walking, but I swear her feet were not touching the ground at all. She was making the movements of somebody walking, but she was floating about a foot off of the ground. And she also had this determined walk. Her arms were hanging down at her sides, but they would sway with each step that she took. That was enough to send me to my dad's room and wake him up. I told him I'd seen a ghost outside of my room, and that it was screaming, that it came out of the woods and was floating off the ground. He did not believe me, told me I was dreaming, and told me to go back to my room. I could tell he'd been drinking again. I tried to plead with him, but he actually yelled at me and told me to go back to my room, that it was all my imagination. I had no choice at that point but to listen to him. He was my father, after all. I went back into my room and cautiously and slowly walked to the window just to take another look. She was still out there, and it looked like she was wandering around on our property, just gliding along. She was screaming, and it looked to me like she wasn't even interested in where she was going. She just kept walking around, making that horrible scream. I watched from the corner of my window until she wandered back into the forest, and the light she was creating disappeared. Obviously, I didn't sleep that night. I only sat in the corner of my room, crying softly because I felt like there was no one that could help me, and that I would be miserable in this house forever. I tried to talk to my dad about it the next morning, but over breakfast, he told me it was my imagination, and that I shouldn't go about telling people that I thought I'd seen a ghost because they'd think I was crazy. I dropped the subject and tried to eat my breakfast. I wasn't hungry, and actually I felt kind of nauseous. I didn't know if it was because of what I encountered, or because I was just so unhappy being there with my dad. It didn't matter though. 3 days after that, my father died. He was out on the boat in the river, probably drunk, and had fallen overboard. He drowned that day. After that, I was sent to live with my granny. I told her everything that I witnessed, knowing that she would have a better response than my dad did. She took everything in that I explained to her, and sat back in silence for a couple of seconds. Then she told me she thought I saw a banshee, and that it was coming to warn me of my father's death. She believed it could sense how sad I was, and this banshee was probably attracted to that sadness. She told me I didn't have anything to worry about from the banshee, that it didn't mean me any harm, and that it was just telling me that everything would be different soon. I lived with Granny until I moved away for college, and if her theory about the banshee coming to tell me everything was going to be okay is actually the reason that I saw it, then the banshee was right too. Because living with her was the best thing that ever happened to me. Don't get me wrong, I was sad that my dad died, but Granny was just so much nicer and caring. She actually made me feel loved, where I didn't have that from my dad. I went from a miserable existence to a happy life by moving in with her. My grades pulled up, I met a guy. When I went off to college, we started dating. Now we're married and have 3 kids. Granny lived to be 98 years old. She's a tough old bird, and I miss her every day. But I know that she's in a happy place. I still don't know what a banshee truly is, whether it's a ghost, or an angel, or something else, but I don't think it matters. It was a scary experience when it happened, but looking back on it as an adult, it wasn't so bad at all. I raised my kids, teaching them that these things do exist, that the fairy world and other creatures like ghosts and banshees do exist, and that some of them, like the banshee that I encountered, aren't frightening, even though they might seem that way in the beginning. Thank you for taking the time out to listen to this story. I always love talking about Granny and honoring her memory. Thank you, and good night.
Hello, Mr. Supernaturalist. I'm writing this encounter to you from Germany, and it's about what you always call a dogman. To me, it looked like a werewolf, but I guess they are different species. How creepy is that? Please forgive me. English is not my first language. I studied it during my schooling, but I was distracted by the pretty girl that sat in front of me. She's my girlfriend, and she's part of this story too. Anyways, for the sake of having a name to go by, you can refer to me as Carl. I'm too scared to give you my real name. This experience has me very scared. I want to tell you about it though, because you and your YouTube friends should know about it, because you like to help people that have these encounters. This all happened to me last summer, but I still feel like it was yesterday. We live in South Germany, in a village close to a beautiful forest called the Black Forest, which is the biggest forest here in Germany. I never thought I would see something so terrible come from a place that is so close to my heart. My girlfriend and I were out late one night, walking around after a date. We were both 20 at the time, and did not want to part ways just yet, so we decided to take a walk. As we were standing there together in one of the fields, just holding each other and kissing, we heard this very strange and scary growling sound coming from further towards the woods. We saw something walking towards us, but since it was on two legs, we just thought it was one of the farming men telling us to get off his land. But as this thing came closer, and we could make it out in the moonlight, we saw it was no man at all. This terrible creature looked like a real werewolf from a scary movie. I can describe it to you very accurately when I sit down with my girlfriend and we put the things we noticed together. It was very large and muscular. I've calculated my height into American measurements, so you can share that with your listeners. I believe you would say I am 6 foot 1 inches tall. This monster must have been 8 foot 6 inches tall. He was a lot taller than me. He looked like a muscle man too. Very big muscles in his legs, chest, neck, and arms. His fur was very dark brown and long. It was covering most of his body, but his facial hair and the arms and legs were not as long. He had very big hands with very long claws, and a very big wolf's head with long teeth and ears, and his eyes seemed to glow in the moonlight, like a nocturnal animal's do. When my girlfriend saw it, she let out a blood-curdling scream that sent a shock through my body. But then that werewolf roared back at her. I thought my heart would explode. My girlfriend grabbed my arm and started to run. She was pulling at me to run with her, but I couldn't take my eyes off of this beast. I was only moving backwards as fast as I could, and couldn't look away. She told me, if we don't run from this monster, it will eat us, and our parents will find our remains. I started running faster after she said that to me. I did not want to be a meal. As we ran, I could hear the heavy creature chasing us. I heard the footsteps, the growling, and the breathing. I did not look back, though. I was afraid of it. I was afraid if I looked back, I would never be able to turn around and run again, because I would be so afraid. We ran for a very long time. I don't know why the monster didn't catch up to us. I know it could have. We ran to the closest house of the person we knew, and started banging on the door like crazy people. I mentioned it was late already that night. It was a friend of my father, and he let us in with no questions because he saw how afraid we were. We told him what we had seen, and he grabbed his rifle from his room. He told us to stay in the house. He was going to see if it was still around. I told him his rifle wasn't going to slay this monster, but he was certain he should go out and check for it. It seemed to take forever to have him finally come back inside. He said nothing was out there, but that he would drive us to our homes, just to be sure. He took his rifle with us as we left. It was very terrifying to walk out to his car, because it was parked on the other side of his land. Every sound I heard made me think that beast was coming back for us, and we were both very happy to reach the car and get inside, knowing that we would be home soon. On our ride back to our homes, he told us he had seen it twice before. Both times it was being tricky and staying in the shadows. Livestock would usually go missing around that time. He thinks it comes from the forest when it can't find enough to eat, and it either wanted some of the meat from one of the fields, or it wanted us. That did not make me feel good. I wanted him to drive faster. He also told us that it could have caught us if it wanted to, and that it was probably just chasing us away from his meal. Once we got back to our homes, my girlfriend wanted to stay with me that night, so we climbed into my bed and tried to forget what happened. That was not easy, and we stayed up most of the night talking about it, and slept very late into the next day. Neither of us have seen that thing since, but we have also not gone over to that village at night since then, and we have not wandered around those fields ever again. Thank you, Carl from Germany.